The history of police militarization is not that remote. It began to develop in the 1960s in a response to similar types of demonstrations that we are seeing today on the college campuses around the country, in opposition to the genocide of the Palestinian people. In the 1960s, after the civil rights, the symbolic victory of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, the struggle for black power and black empowerment began to take hold in the urban areas of the United States. Every summer, every almost year round, black colonies that we call the hood today were erupting against the police brutality and racist segregation that was still at large in the black urban areas. And in order to deal with this uprising and this militant turn in the civil rights movement, the United States government launched this counterintelligence program to subvert black movements, black leaders, to neutralize black leadership, and to make sure that black people did not coalesce into an independent political party or independent political entity based on a militant understanding and a militant demand for black human rights and black civil rights. So it became very important for the United States government to set an example, to curtail, to set an example of the consequences for black struggle, for militancy, for black radicalism. So when Kwame Ture, who we know as Stokely Carmichael, first shouted "Black Power," I believe it was in the march on Selma, and shout out to SNCC and organizers of SNCC, who first threw up their fist and declared Black Power. The U.S. government was terrified by this very notion of black empowerment, this very idea that black people would organize themselves independent of the Democratic and Republican Party. And at the same time, 2 years later, after the symbolic victory of the Voting Rights Act, the Black Panther Party came into existence in 1966 in Oakland, California. The founders, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, advocated armed self-defense, that African people had the right to self-defense against racist attack and against racist police murder and racist police violence. So the Black Panther Party issued a number of declarations demanding that black people arm themselves or otherwise they will harm themselves, and that we had a right to self-defense. So Black Panther Party officers sprung up across the country as black activists joined the call for black self-defense, began to organize in the community for community control of the police, began to organize in the community for decentralization of the police. This sent shockwaves through the establishment, and so in 1969, early 1969, the police launched an attack on the Los Angeles Police Department, on the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party. And they launched this attack with a militarized unit that they call SWAT. And this was the first time that the term SWAT came into the public lexicon. They launched this attack with militarized vehicles, with police officers in armored vests and with helmets and military assault rifles. They launched this attack on the Black Panther Party office. And the idea was to send a message to black people that you could not resist the legal violence of the state. That anybody that talked about self-defense in their community, they would be met with unmitigated violence and repression. But the problem is that the Black Panther office was fortified. It was fortified, and police didn't know it was fortified. So when they attacked the Black Panther office early on the morning in 1969, they found themselves repulsed, and they found themselves having to forge or establish a siege of the Black Panther office, which allowed the community to come out and witness what was happening, or what allowed the TV cameras to come out and witness what was going on. And the Panthers in the office then surrendered, and they came out alive. This sent a signal that we could defend ourselves against the armed agents of the state. And I like to add too that just 4 days before, Fred Hampton was assassinated by a similar attack in Chicago by the Chicago Police Department. He was assassinated and murdered in his sleep, and he was drugged by an undercover agent of the FBI who gave the necessary information to access the Panther location to the Chicago Police Department, and they murdered Fred Hampton in his sleep. But that didn't happen with the Panthers in LA. And so it was at this time that we first heard the word SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. And from then on, as the anti-Vietnam War protests grew, as black radicalism became more assertive, the right to self-defense became more vocal. Black students took over Jackson State University armed and demanded a change in the curriculum at that university. As these protests arose, and the idea of black self-defense and community control began to take hold, the United States government began its special operations to militarize the police. They passed the Omnibus Crime and Control Bill that allowed the police to be trained on military bases. It was called the War on Crime. And then also Nixon, when he came into office, in order to divide the peace movement from the black liberation movement, from the militant black struggles, he devised or created the War on Drugs. And then we had LBJ, before he left office, declaring the War on Poverty. And so all of these wars were designed to encapsulate black ideas of political autonomy and self-defense. And we have today what we have, the Congressional Black Caucus, which are a bunch of bootlickers and elected officials who grew out of the war on poverty from the poverty pimps of the late 60s and early 70s. And we have the mayors of black faces in high places, police chiefs that have come out of the counter to our community control of our institutions and public safety. Well, I like to say that one of the major objectives of the United States government was to make sure that the African diaspora never unified with Africans on the continent around the idea and the notion of pan-African liberation. That this had to be dispelled. And so they came up with a whole bunch of economic black capitalist programs.
Message!
Like trans-African economic help, and they used the word trans-African because to use the word pan-African would mean they would have to rewrite the history of the pan-African movement, which evolved and developed in the diaspora. It began with Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Pan-African movement of the early 20th century, and it evolved in all the way up to the liberation and the emancipation of Ghana. I believe it was 1957. Yeah, under Kwame Nkrumah, Assegiefo Kwame Nkrumah, who was a Pan-African and who stated at the beginning of the nation state of Ghana that the independence of Ghana was meaningless without the total independence and unity of Africa and from colonialism and ideas of capitalist imperialism and white supremacy. So there's always been a concerted effort by the United States government, by the European unions, by European former colonizers to maintain a rift between the African diaspora and the black, the Pan-African movements on the continent. And so just as Olombe Brath, who was my mentor in Pan-Africanism, taught me, he said that we are beset, and when he said we were talking about the Africans in the diaspora. He said we are beset by a post-traumatic syndrome called the residual absentee slave mentality. And that we think of ourselves as victims, and we struggle within the paradigm of white supremacy as victims. We begin to look at ourselves as victims rather than look at our history of resistance, our radical traditions of resistance, and the victories that we have won ever since the bullwhip days. And he says on the African continent there's a similar syndrome, and it's called the residual absentee colonial mentality. And this is the mentality of the neo-colonialists. This is the mentality of the bootlickers who are presently part and parcel of the political elite in many of the African countries. This is why we have the African Union, which came out of the original OAU. This is why we have an African Union that sat idly by while Gaddafi was deposed and murdered by NATO and the U.S. and the United States. And this is why we have the most volatile and significant humanitarian crisis going on right now outside of Palestine and Sudan. And this is why we don't understand the struggle in Sudan. We don't put the struggle in Sudan in the forefront because we don't know of our relationship to Africa and how our tax dollars to maintain the U.S. military goes into maintaining AFRICOM and the U.S. presence in Africa. And that's designed to protect and defend the Western access to the resources of the African continent. So it was always a design to maintain that the Pan-African unity that emanated from the diaspora would never take effect on the African continent. And that's changing today. The Americans are being kicked out of Niger.
That's right.
The French are being run out of Mali, run out of Burkina Faso, and Chad, and the U.S. is desperately financing the UAE militarily to try to undermine the transition to democracy in the Sudan. So we need to understand now Pan-Africanism is more crucial and is more vital than ever before. Pan-Africanism is a solidarity with all oppressed people who are opposed to colonialism and the neurotic notion of white supremacy and U.S. imperialism. The idea and the notions of Cop City is to create training facilities for militarized police to develop their ability and capacity to control urban resistance, to control urban uprisings, to control the colonies, the black colonies and domestic colonies in America. Now, this training is not just confined to U.S. law enforcement. They have police special units from the EU, from Israel, who also contribute and participate in these training activities. In fact, Israel has been one of the foremost trainers of U.S. militarized policing. Much of the tactics that's being used today against demonstrators, much of the tactics of use of intelligence apparatus to identify leaders in these demonstrators and isolate them and neutralize them and arrest them, come from the Israelis' experience with suppressing and controlling the Palestinian uprising, the people of Palestine trying to assert their right to self-determination. So there's a connection between the COP cities. I think there's over 59 of them right now in various forms of development across the country. And all of them are contiguous to or near black majority population districts. So we need to understand militarized policing means that today, right now, here and now, we are living in a police state, and that the facade of democracy is only a facade, because we could see that when the people come out to protest the genocide in Palestine, the police are unleashed upon them, and they're beaten and repressed. And I just want to say in ending that the Pan-African movement has always been in solidarity with the Palestinian people. It has always been in solidarity with the people in Africa who are struggling for their liberation and their freedom. This goes all the way back to the Black Panther Party, when we had a working alliance with the PFLP, when we had a working alliance with the Palestinian movement. So I just want to say shout out to all of the brothers and sisters who are on these campuses, who are holding the United States government to account. I want to say shout out to all of those who are backing this and keep up the fight and don't give up the fight. Aluta continua and power to the people.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.